what we do. So we're a think tank, so research and policy institute. We've been around for about 15 years now. And we do research and policy work on the role that cities play in helping the UK cities improve their economic performance. So we've long been advocates of the devolution agenda, and I've been working more specifically on net zero. So I've been working in the run up to COP26 on the role that cities play again in helping the UK meet its 2050 target. And then we've also been looking at a number of devolution deals, looking at how those deals can make that happen. So in terms of the overview of today's presentation, so I'll be looking very quickly at our work in terms of the role that cities and urban areas play in that space, looking at the most recent and not so recent devolution deals with a focus on two different aspects. One is transport and one is housing. So in terms of context for today's discussion, and in terms of, I guess, an overview of our work on net zero and devolution. So we know that the UK has made really good progress in the past 2 decades on net zero. We've cut emissions by half since 1990. But the issue is that the remaining half of the challenge is likely to be much more difficult for 2 reasons. The first is that it will require cutting emissions in 2 areas in which we have seen very little progress so far, which are transport and housing, and it needs to happen now. So 2050 may seem like a distant target, but actually the bulk of it needs to happen in the 2020s and the 2030s. Now, we also know that a lot of this progress towards carbon neutrality will have to come not just from technological change, but also from behavior change. So I guess a bit of setting for today's conversation is this is a reflection on how we can make that happen and how we can facilitate behavior change and at what level. So what we have been doing in our work is to look at the role cities play in helping the UK meet the net zero target. And here I'm looking at cities and urban areas as a spatial entity, as an urban built environment. And what our research and others have found is that on these 2 counts, on transport and on housing, urban areas are the best place to cut carbon emissions because of the way our immediate built environment influences our daily lifestyles and by extension, our carbon footprints. So I won't go into too much detail on what is the case today. But when you look at the data, you can see very clearly that carbon footprints on these 2 accounts, on transport and on housing, are lower in cities than elsewhere. Let me just, yes, you can see my slides correctly. So I'm just checking. Oh, yes, that's the go. There was a chart I couldn't see on my slides. Right. So as you can see on the chart, on these 2 accounts, on transport and on housing, carbon emissions are lower in cities than elsewhere. Now, that doesn't mean that cities only will have to lead the transition. There are a lot of areas, in particularly coastal areas, which, where a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of investment in wind and solar and carbon capture will require space, and cities, that can't happen in cities, but cities will play a crucial role. And this, I think, has important implications for how we think about, about this journey to net zero in terms of the strategy, but also in terms of the tools, the powers, and the funding structure that comes with it. So obviously, net zero is a national strategy, and it's a target that's set by the government. But ultimately, the government will be held to account when it comes to meeting this target. But I guess if the discussion for today is, are devolution deals good for the environment, and is devolution good for the environment, then I think the answer is yes. Partly because devolution is good for progress on these issues. So at Simple Cities, we have very long been advocates of the devolution agenda for a number of reasons. Giving city regions a stronger voice, joining up economic strategies at the right geography and at the right level of power, and make places more accountable. That is true across a number of strategies, but crucially, it's true when it comes to the net zero strategy. And so it's very clear now that this progress cannot happen if it's solely piloted from Whitehall. And obviously, that's I think core to today's discussion. So in terms of where we are in terms of progress, so we know that we now have 10 city regions that have directly elected mayors. That covers 40% of England's population, almost 50% of its economic output, and about 1/3 of its greenhouse gas emissions. And the new devolution deals that were concluded in 2022, and that I think more than half of England's population will have a directly elected mayor by 2024. So we know that those devolved mayoral authorities, they don't have a sort of duty to deliver on net zero, and the current net zero strategy that was published, I think, just before COP26, doesn't really state, a clear responsibility for local government and combined authorities on this. There's not a clearly defined role or regional emissions target, for instance. But still, despite this, there's a number of combined authorities that regard, cutting emissions as a core part of their responsibility, and they've used a number of tools such as regional carbon budgets to do so, and very often, they have even more ambitious targets than the national target itself that is set by the government for 2050. So this varies a lot between places. Greater Manchester and West Yorkshire, I think, have set for 2038, West of England and Greater London 2030, West Midlands 2040. Some don't have a specific target, but it varies a lot between places. Now, in terms of the powers that a lot of these places and combined authorities do have to actually achieve these targets, again, if you take solely those two sectors, transport and housing, which these two levers which we'll have to use to make faster progress on net zero. There are lots of levers at the local level of government, and I would sort of classify them in three categories. Some that are already available and have been devolved in existing devolution deals, some that have been devolved in maybe the most recent devolution deals or that will be in the future ones, and some that haven't been devolved and should be a responsibility for local government and combined authority. So I'll go into sort of detail in those in a moment, but I did have a table here that sort of summarizes. So this is not from us, this is from the Institute for Government, and it's a quite a useful overview and a snapshot of the current levels of powers that have been devolved across different combined authorities. So as you can see, for instance, with the exception of the North of Tyne, mayors do have a multi-year budget on transport, on skills, less so perhaps when it comes to housing and to building standards, planning and retrofit. But this, I think, gives a useful overview of the existing state of play in terms of the powers that have been devolved in existing devolution deals. Now, in terms of what's covered in existing devolution deals across different policy areas, and I'll take the example of transport and housing here. So on transport, again, there are two main government objectives. One is modal shift, achieving modal shift in urban travel and increasing the share of journeys that are made by public transport or by active travel. And the second is the electrification of the fleet. And on both these accounts, coordinating and allocating sufficient resources at the right level of government will be key for success. So in terms of the powers that have been devolved so far, some of them are part of devolution deals at the combined authority level, and some are still with local authorities directly. So to give a few examples of the powers that are owned locally, in that space, local authorities are in charge of transport planning, road management, cycle lanes, parking policies, park and ride, charging scheme like clean air zones. All those are held at the local level. Workplace parking levies are another example. If you look at Nottingham, for instance, which I think is, for now, possibly, I think with Leicester, the only city that has implemented a working workplace parking levy. The city has raised 75 million, which was then used to fund part of the extension of the tram network, and that's a very useful example for other places as well. Another example is bus franchising. So the Bus Services Act of 2017 gives mayoral combined authorities outside London the right to franchise the regional bus system, which bring buses under their control, particularly in terms of ticketing and route. And so far, so Greater Manchester and Liverpool have decided to exercise these powers, and that's very important, and it's a very welcome progress. So a core argument that we at Centre for Cities have made for quite a long time now is that buses do play a very important part, not just of the sort of economic levelling up agenda, but also of the net zero agenda, in part because it will help moving away from the car dependency. And so this sort of complex ticketing system that's very often not integrated with the rest of the network, high fares, all that has for a long time disincentivized people from using buses. So again, giving mayors the powers to do so and to address this has been a very important move in the right direction. So I looked briefly at the evidence that Greater Manchester gave recently on other types of policies, such as the impact of the £2 fares on bus ridership, which again was a power that was devolved to them. And the evidence, is there. There's, I think there was a paper yesterday published showing that in the short amount of time that the policy has been in place, there's been a huge increase. I think it was something like 1.5 million extra passengers on the bus in terms of ridership since the measure was introduced. So definitely there's been progress on this, and that will help cut carbon emissions and help the Combined Authority as a whole and the city region meet its net zero target. And again, transport is a core part of the trailblazer deals that have been signed and whether we talked about and confirmed yesterday with the budget. So we can maybe talk about the detail of those a bit later, but my understanding is that it further, I think, deepens the devolving of powers that have been agreed in 2017 in some of these places. So again, to use the example of Greater Manchester, it will likely help develop and grow the B network closer to a London-style transport system for the city region as a whole. I guess the major announcements that have been made yesterday was on the sort of full integration of rail services within the B network. And that's, I suppose, good news, but happy to sort of discuss that in greater detail later on. Again, on the transport front, the Chancellor also confirmed yesterday the extension of the city region sustainable transport settlement, and that's again a great news in that regard, given it's a major source of funding that combined authorities rely on. Now, in terms of the shortfalls of the existing system so far, so the first is that, again, on the transport front, it's a fairly complex and fragmented landscape across different levels of different layers of local government. And I think that's an issue that prevents progress from being made on certain areas. So, responsibility very often falls within different levels of government, and existing devolution deals haven't really simplified that to the extent that it should. The current, sort of two-tier system is still fairly inefficient. To give an example, on the transport front, district councils are the local planning authority and county councils are the local transport authority. And that makes it very difficult to coordinate and plan at scale, particularly to integrate transport and planning. And devolution deals haven't quite addressed that. There isn't also a clear sort of accountability. To give an example of this, we've done a bit of work on clean air zones. Obviously, there's been progress on those in recent years, but there isn't a clear, there is a lack of clarity in terms of who's responsible for delivery, and there's no proper enforcement process. And I think that's preventing many places from implementing clean air zones. So again, something to maybe discuss later on. I'm sure Victoria has loads of things to say about that one. I won't go too far on down that route. In terms of, again, the issues that existing devolution deals haven't quite solved, one is, the funding allocation is very much still based on competitive bidding. Very often, combined authorities have very little time to apply for funding. That makes, long-term planning difficult because they also don't have that much flexibility in terms of how to use the spending and the fundings. And so, that again makes it quite difficult to achieve progress when it's sort of bounded to a very short period of time. Another problem, I guess, is that the total fundings that are often committed fall short of what's needed given the scale of the challenge. So to give an example, the National Infrastructure Commission identified something like 30 billion additional investment needed on the transport front outside of London up to 2040. And, the existing deals that we have heard so far, fall short of this in terms of total amount of cash that's being made available to combined authorities and rail combined authorities in that space. So it's very often scattered investments across different pots of spendings that are not always integrated within a large, sort of block grant, to make it sort of easier to invest in the long term. And very often, local authorities or combined authorities do have a fairly short period of time, which makes it difficult to plan at scale. And then the final thing is that there is still a lack of fiscal powers and very little flexibility for places in terms of how they use and manage their funding. And existing devolution deals, again, haven't quite solved that issue. So if you take, mayoral combined authorities outside London, they're very much dependent on government funding for capital investment. They often have to bid on a rolling 5-year basis, which means that there is tighter central control over their spending decisions. If you compare this with London, for instance, Transport for London is able to raise funds from the increase in land value that arises from its transport investments, but that's not the case outside London. And other devolved mayoral authorities are not currently able to capture land from those land value from transport investments. And that's again, there's still quite a bit of difference between the powers that the Greater London Authority does have and the powers that other mayoral authorities have. And I guess on this point specifically, aside from achieving London-style transport system, I think there's also a lot to learn from elsewhere. So we've been doing a bit of work looking at devolution deals across other city regions in Europe, particularly. And on the transport front, we've looked at a few examples in France. So if you look at Paris, for instance, Paris has a funding tool that's called Versement Transport, which gives local governments the power to raise a sort of local payroll tax, and that funds the public transport system. So that makes the public transport system way less reliant on fares, but also on government subsidies. And again, that's something that we could learn from in terms of the future devolution deals. That was an overview on the transport front, and I'll finish off with planning and housing, which is also something we've been looking at, both in terms of the role that planning and housing plays, in terms of helping the UK meet its net zero target, but also what that's meant for devolution deals. So again, outside of devolution deals specifically, there are a lot of powers that local governments do already have to take action. Planning is an extremely important and very often sort of underestimated tool to cut carbon footprint. Again, one of the reasons why cities and urban areas do have a lower carbon footprint is because of the benefits brought about by density. So dense urban environment makes it easier to walk or cycle because journeys are shorter. And it also makes public transport more viable. So the urban form is extremely important when it comes to, when we think about those issues of net zero and environmental sort of carbon emissions. And they're often not considered, as such a key lever for net zero policies. And that's a problem because so far, a lot of the way that we have planned our cities has been building very often car-dependent communities, fairly low-rise developments, and not very dense, not just in the 1960s, but also very recent developments. And this needs to change if we are to meet the net zero target. So again, in terms of what that means, in terms of powers, funding, and sort of devolution. So as a local planning authorities, local governments already are in charge of designing local plans and granting planning permissions, so they can influence the location and the type of new developments that are being built, and they have some control over building regulations standard. And I think there isn't anything very specific in existing devolution deals on these issues. So the problem at the moment is that combined authorities and metro mayors across the country don't have the powers that the Mayor of London has on these issues, particularly in terms of integrating planning and transport together. So effectively in the UK, no local leader, with the exception of the Mayor of London, has the power to integrate within a single coordinated strategy, and in the case of London, that's the London Plan, transport and planning policies. So in London, for instance, there's a tool that is called Public Transport Accessibility Levels, which is used to optimize density levels with transport provisions, and therefore to coordinate the provision of housing with existing and future public transport plans. That is crucial to encourage.
One more minute.
Yes, I'm literally nearly there. that is crucial to encourage the take-up of active travel, but these powers have not been part of existing devolution deals so far. So everywhere else it's highly fragmented. It's either split at different levels of government or split with Whitehall, and that needs to change if we are to cut our carbon footprint. I'd say one final thing on retrofits. So moving on to the housing part, and I'm sure we'll talk about it in the discussion later on. Retrofit, I think, is an example of where so far there's been a bit of lack of clarity in terms of who holds the powers, particularly with the Green Homes Grant that has been scrapped a few years ago. But the Trailblazer deals we have been announced yesterday, I think, state that the retrofit now fall within the mayor's purview, and that funding will be done not through competition, but through allocation, which I guess is a very good news. And I'll stop here. Thank you.